In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for member statements has concluded. The Prime Minister
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Minister
I inform the House that the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment will be absent from question time today, and I believe for the remainder of the week we'll update the House. The Treasurer will answer questions on his behalf in Trade, Tourism and Investment portfolio, and I will answer questions on his behalf in the Foreign Affairs portfolio.
Questions without notice. The member for Werribee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Gandangara Health Services is a First Nations organisation in Liverpool, a COVID hotspot. Gandangara's CEO says they've only been allocated around 40 vaccine doses per day, and we are being asked to fill a Grand Canyon-sized need with a handful of pebbles. Why did the Prime Minister say yesterday's challenges in the vaccine rollout had been overcome when they simply have not?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And today, indeed just before question time, an additional 500,000 doses will be added to the some 4.5 million Pfizer doses that will be distributed over the course of September. The 1 million Moderna doses that will go out in September, and the many millions more of AstraZeneca doses. And I particularly want to thank all the GPs and the pharmacists around the country, Mr Speaker, who are doing such a fantastic job together with the state hubs and the nurses and others who are supporting those many points of presence, some over 9,000 points of presence right across the country, Mr Speaker, whether they be in Western Sydney or up in North Queensland or down in Tasmania or over in the West, wherever they may be, doing an extraordinary job. So much so that now, as we approach the end of August, 35% of our population aged over 16 has had 2 doses, and 58.7% have had their first dose. Importantly, very importantly, those aged over 70, 87.4%, our most vulnerable, have had their first dose, and 62.9% have had their second dose. More than 50% of over 50s have now had both doses of the vaccine, Mr Speaker. And what we've been able to do, particularly over the course of September, is we've been able to, and August, as we're going into September and over August, is by bringing forward those doses, by getting access to those extra 1 million doses that were Pfizer doses we were able to get out of Poland. Now the extra 500,000 that are coming from the arrangement with Singapore, Mr Speaker, and I thank Prime Minister Lee and all of those involved in that initiative. And the other irons we have in the fire, Mr Speaker, means there are more and more doses. And that means, Mr Speaker, that we are fast approaching the time where everyone in this country will have had the opportunity to have had that vaccine. We are fast approaching that time, and I want to thank everyone across the country for the sterling job they've been doing in rolling up their sleeves and getting those vaccines, Mr Speaker, as we are operating at vaccination rates on a weekly basis on a per capita terms that exceeds even those highest levels achieved in the United States and the United Kingdom.
And I call the member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The National Plan will bring Australia through the COVID-19 pandemic by reopening our economy and ensuring Australians can live with the virus. Will the Prime Minister please inform the House about the importance of sticking to this National Plan?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bass for her question. And along with her and all Tasmanians, I want to thank Tasmanians for the great job that they've been doing, because they have the highest double-dose rate of vaccination in the country. Tasmania leads the way at 42%. I'm sure the member for Bradden is also very excited about that, Mr Speaker. 42% double doses in Tasmania. And in a state, Mr Speaker, where the level of COVID has been significantly below the more populous states, like New South Wales and Victoria and the ACT and indeed even Queensland, Mr Speaker. And yet in that state in Tasmania, they are doing an amazing job in maintaining very high rates, in fact the highest rate of double-dose vaccination anywhere in the country. And Mr Speaker, that is essential to the National Plan, because the National Plan enables Australia to live with the virus, not live in fear of it. And by doing that, Mr Speaker, we can move all of the country forward together. But we acknowledge, whether it be in the member's home state of Tasmania or my home state of New South Wales, Mr Speaker, or the Treasurer's home state there in Victoria, we're all starting from different places under this National Plan, but we're all heading to the same location. And that same location, that same destination, that same goal of the national plan is to connect Australians once again, all with each other, and to connect Australians with the rest of the world. And, Mr Speaker, that plan is about getting children back at school, Mr Speaker. It's about getting businesses open and ensure that they can stay open. It's about ensuring that we're getting Australians back in the hours, in their jobs, in their workplaces, Mr Speaker. It's about getting planes back in the air. It's about getting tourists back into towns and regions right across this country from one end to the other, and indeed enabling Australians to travel once again beyond our own shores. That's what the plan is achieving, because we know that the lockdowns are taking a heavy toll on Australians, on their well-being, not only on the economic well-being of this country, but even more significantly on the physical well-being of Australians and the mental health toll that we know that the lockdowns are imposing on the country. And that's why it continues to be so urgent that we move together as part of this national plan. Vaccinations, of course, are a key part of that plan. And I've already responded on the issue of 500,000 additional Pfizer doses secured in our dose swap arrangement with the government of Singapore. I thank Prime Minister Lee. I thank the Minister for Health. Also, Mr Speaker, the High Commissioner, another great Tasmanian, Mr Speaker, in Will Hodgman, our High Commissioner up there in Singapore, in putting this arrangement together, which gets September off as we enter it, as we spring into spring, Mr Speaker, with 500,000 doses of additional hope, courtesy of that arrangement, which sees our national plan advanced.
And I give the call to the member for Barton. Member for Barton. We might go to the next question and perhaps come back. I'll call the member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware that today the New South Wales Health Minister, Brad Hazzard, confirmed the gap between first and second doses of the Pfizer vaccine in Sydney will be spaced out to 8 weeks? Mr Hazzard said, simply, there is not enough Pfizer in New South Wales or Victoria for the people who are now wanting it. Why didn't the Prime Minister do his job on vaccines?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the decision to focus on first doses in New South Wales was a decision taken together between the Commonwealth Government and the New South Wales Government. And it was done so, Mr Speaker, because of the outbreak that was occurring in south-western Sydney, and to ensure that we maximise the use of vaccines in that part of the country, that part of Sydney, to ensure that we lifted the level of resilience and to seek to slow that spread of the virus in those parts of New South Wales. That was a very sensible plan. And we added to that plan, and indeed in New South Wales, the government has provided to New South Wales almost 1 million additional doses beyond their allocations, Mr Speaker, both in bring forwards of Pfizer doses and in new complete over-allocation doses, 500,000 specifically, that was made available from the Polish arrangement that the government was able to secure, Mr Speaker, and that I was able to secure with the Polish Prime Minister. That is what our plan was when those issues arose in south-western Sydney, to get the additional doses into New South Wales, supported by the New South Wales Government. Those arrangements were done directly between myself and the Premier, Mr Speaker, over many days to ensure that we could maximise. Now, that was not done at the expense of other states and territories. The Commonwealth did not divert doses from other states and territories to New South Wales. Mr Speaker, we maximised the use of the doses we had available, and we went outside our borders and got more doses to support New South Wales that was facing the most difficult part of this crisis that they had seen over the course of the entire pandemic. So, Mr Speaker, we have been supporting New South Wales heavily as they've worked through this very difficult time. And what we know is because we were able to vaccinate, in particular, those who are in residential aged care facilities, we know that the fatality rate of what we observed during the Victorian wave when the vaccine wasn't in place was some 4.2%. That rate has fallen to 0.45% in New South Wales this year, Mr Speaker, because of the work done to protect our most vulnerable people in that state, Mr Speaker, and indeed across the country. So 800 or thereabouts of those who lost their lives last year during the second wave in Victoria, and that has fallen by almost 90%, with the same amount of cases, indeed more cases, in New South Wales this time. So we will continue to work with New South Wales I will continue to work with every single Premier and Chief Minister, despite the criticism that is made of me seeking to work with those Premiers and Chief Ministers. I will keep working with them every single day, as I have throughout this COVID pandemic, to continue to bring them together, Mr Speaker, to focus on the national plan, which means we can live with this virus, not live in fear of it.
The member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on the importance of the Morrison-Joyce government's national plan in the safe recovery of our regional economies from the COVID-19 pandemic, and is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any alternate policies?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Not. Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. And I know that the member for Cowper, Mr Speaker, has been such a champion, especially for the chemist rollout. The member for Cowper has also been a champion in understanding that we have to have a safe plan and we have to be able to make sure that we get this nation back to where it was, returning the liberties and freedoms that people were born with. We know how important that is for things such as the Coffs Harbour bypass. I was speaking to the member for Cowper and he was noting in the Coffs Harbour bypass that it's going to remove 12 sets of traffic lights, take 12,000 cars off the road, 3 tunnels, but we can only build that $1.8 billion piece of infrastructure if we have the workers on the site. And the workers can only get onto the site if they have a belief that they are safe and they have the capacity to go to work without hindrance, which is what we are delivering. And it's not just that, it's not just the big projects, it's also things such as Lanes Bridge at Barraville, only a $1 million project, but incredibly important to the people of Barraville. Or the Coramba Road and Azalea Avenue roundabout, which is even smaller, $200,000, but incredibly important for them. We note that in the work the member for Cowper has done in pursuing the purpose of getting pharmacies out, 921 pharmacies now, in 921 pharmacies are administering vaccines in regional areas. We've got 2,645 locations in regional areas are getting this. And this is having an outcome, not only in the member for Cowper's electorate, where we can see in Port Macquarie 60% of people, 67% of people have now received at least one inoculation, and in Bellingen, as you head towards the hills towards my electorate, 64.3% have received one inoculation, and that is the case across the country. Whether it's in Walker, just up the road from me, 73.7% of people have received one inoculation. In Warren and Parks, 76.7% of people, and Gundawindi, 73% of people. Now, the member for Cowper also asked if I know of any alternate policies, and I don't. I don't. In fact, I turned on the Insiders on the weekend to listen to the Shadow Minister, the member for Hindmarsh, and his policy for the Labor Party going forward. And I don't know, do you guys up there know what the answer was? I don't. Did anybody here know what the answer is? I couldn't understand what the answer was because they have no alternate. They have no alternate policy. And you'd think that if the member for Hindmarsh, the Shadow Minister for Health, was going to go on the Insiders, that he would have gone there with a policy to inform the Australian people what would happen under the Labor Party. But it's quite clear. Nothing is going to happen under the Labor Party because they have no plan.
And I call the member for Oxley.
My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Agriculture. Can the Minister explain how a text message sent by the Minister for Agriculture to the Deputy Prime Minister last Wednesday about the Inland Rail route appeared in the Weekend Australian? Does the Minister for Agriculture agree with the Deputy Prime Minister that the Inland Rail route is settled?
The Leader of the House. The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Well, Mr Speaker, that is not a topic that the Deputy Prime Minister could have any knowledge of. And, and
members on my left.
The text message sent to somebody else, allegedly by somebody, is not within the knowledge of the Deputy Prime Minister, Mr Speaker, and the question is out of order.
The Manager of Opposition Business on the point of order.
Yeah, I'm a bit astonished. Sorry, on to the point of order.
I'm perpetually astonished, but anyway, go on.
Thanks, Speaker. To the point of order, the Leader of the House is alleging that the Deputy Prime Minister is not in a position to answer whether or not a text message was sent to him, and it's about Inland Rail, for which he is responsible.
But the point I'm going to make, and I can take members through practice if you really want to, is ministers can't be just asked about newspaper reports, reports in party rooms, allegations left, right and centre. That's been well established, and I'm conscious of not going over it all. I will if I have to, but it just eats up a lot of question time. If it's the case yet, the manager of opposition is...
Without disputing anything that you just put there about newspaper reports and the like, the substance of this is two things. One, it relates to a message between one minister and another, between the minister the Deputy Prime Minister is representing and himself, about Inland Rail, and asks whether or not the Inland Rail route is settled. The Deputy Prime Minister has to be responsible for that, has to be able to answer that. And
I'll tell you what I'll do. I mean, most of the question is out of order about text messages and newspaper reports, and it's not in the position for the chair to judge the accuracy of those, and as I can't judge the accuracy of claims made in questions and answers. But in terms of the policy topic of the Inland Rail, the Deputy Prime Minister can answer, but as I've pointed out before, he's not terribly confined given the nature of the question that's been asked. The Deputy Prime Minister.
I genuinely thank the member for his question, and can right at the start saying the route is determined. It is absolutely set. It's been through Cabinet, and we're getting on with it. We are getting on with the job. That is what we do. And why we are getting on with the job? Because this 1,700-kilometre piece of nation-building infrastructure is so vital for us taking this economy ahead. This 1,700-kilometre piece of infrastructure will have trains going along at 3.6 kilometres long, at 110 kilometres an hour. This 1,700-kilometre piece of infrastructure, Mr Speaker, each one of those trains will take 110 B doubles off the road. It will take more than 150 semi-trailers off the road, each one using around about over 600 litres of diesel. One of the great carbon abatement policies that goes to show how the Prime Minister and myself and our colleagues are using technology. We are using technology to take this nation ahead, and that 1,700-kilometre piece of infrastructure that will drive decentralisation, drive the growth of the town of Parkes, drive the growth of the town of Narrabri, drive the growth of the town of Goondiwindi, drive the growth of the city of Toowoomba, assist in the further growth of the great cities of Melbourne and Brisbane. And we have a vision. We have a vision for this nation, because we could not rely on the Labor Party's vision for this nation. We could not. For them, the best we got was it was a nice idea, a nice idea. But it's not a nice idea for us, it is a reality. And as we drive this piece of infrastructure forward, we are going to make sure that the people who produce the culverts, the people who produce the bridges, will be producing the jobs in regional Australia, even in my own electorate of New England. We are building the culverts. We have jobs. A place that used to only have 12 jobs now has over 100 jobs. And that is this nation at work. And that is competent management. And that is us taking this project ahead. And every day, I'm making sure that we put our shoulder to the wheel to see this project finalised. I am very happy that you ask about the Inland Rail, because every time we see the Inland Rail, we see something that the Coalition is doing and the Labor Party never did. No intention of doing. Was never going to happen. Never going to happen. All we have, and we still have, as now they are talking that they might do it to Gladstone. They're never going to do any else of it. Of course they're not going to do it to Gladstone, because they don't believe in it. But we do. So I thank the honourable member for his question, and I look forward to many more questions on one of the great pieces of infrastructure on this nation that we will build, we will see complete, because we have a plan.
And I call the member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Minister, I understand there are 4,427 Afghan refugees living in the Australian community on SHEV or temporary protection visas. Given the horrendous events unfolding in Afghanistan, will the government now provide these recognised refugees permanent residency visas?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Well, thank you, and I thank the member for her question, and I'm sure that she, along with everyone in the House and in this place, is very much aware of the significant needs of Afghan communities, whether they are remaining in Afghanistan or whether they are here in Australia. What I can say to the member, and I'm more than happy to continue this discussion outside this place today, what I can say to her is that particularly the Minister for Immigration, but both he and myself are working very closely with local communities here in Australia. We need to understand and come to terms with a range of issues in relation to those people who have been in Afghanistan and are either on their way to Australia or have just come here. We need to continue to do the work that is necessary with the Afghan community that is already within Australia. I can assure her that that work is underway. The Minister for Immigration is taking a leading role in that, and we will continue to do all that we can to support those people who are currently in Australia and who are on their way here.
And I call the member for Bennelong.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on why Australians can trust the Morrison government's strong economic management and its support for small businesses to help our economy bounce back from the Delta strain of the COVID-19 pandemic by sticking to the national plan? And is the Treasurer aware of any alternate policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bennelong for his question and acknowledge his strong advocacy on behalf of business across his electorate. Indeed, more than 23,000 businesses in the electorate of Bennelong are eligible for the extended instant asset write-off, Mr Speaker. And I had the pleasure to join the member for Bennelong in his electorate not that long ago to visit a great Australian company, namely Cochlear, which is at the forefront of technological innovation. Now, Mr Speaker, last year the Australian economy faced into and stared into the economic abyss. Treasury thought that unemployment could reach as high as 15%. And that we could see the economy contract in one quarter by more than 20%. The Morrison government responded with unprecedented amounts of economic support, and we saw strong economic growth in the back half of last year, and we've seen the unemployment rate fall to a 12-year low of 4.6%. But right now, we have our two largest states in lockdown, and tomorrow is the national accounts. And for the June quarter, we have seen 29 days in the June quarter we have seen of lockdowns, meaning at least one part of the country was in lockdown for the period of 29 days over the course of that quarter, including 5 out of the 8 jurisdictions, and our 4 largest states experienced some form of lockdown over the course of that June quarter. So no matter what the result is tomorrow, the exact number is tomorrow, it doesn't change the fact today that our economy faces some significant challenges. That's why we're going to continue with the economic support, both income support as well as business support, and that's why we have to stick to the plan agreed to at National Cabinet, a plan that will see restrictions ease at 70 to 80%. But if it's not enough for small business to be fighting the virus, small business is now fighting a Labor Party, Mr Speaker, that is seeking to destroy one of the fundamental pillars of our tax system, namely the protection of confidential information. And the Labor Party is seeking to have the data of more than 10,000 businesses dumped in the Senate, Mr Speaker. This is what the Australian Hotels Association has said of Labor's proposal. It's a dangerous political stunt. This is what the Australian Industry Group has said of Labor's proposal. It's a dangerous precedent. This is what the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry has said of Labor's proposal. It's a deliberate attempt to smear. And this is what the Council of Small Business across Australia has said of Labor's tactics. It's determined and has been pursued for pure political gain. So, Mr Speaker, while businesses were seeking the support of government in the middle of a pandemic, the Labor Party is now seeking to attack them and come after them.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Most economists expect that economic growth had slowed in the June quarter and is now going backwards in the September quarter. Why doesn't the Prime Minister take responsibility for the fact that Australia's economic recovery was always hostage to his failures on vaccines and quarantine?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Australia is one of few countries in the world that, after the COVID-19 recession of last year, saw our economy grow back to a level higher than it was before the pandemic started, and that is before Delta hit, Mr Speaker, and saw 1 million people get back into work. Now, Mr Speaker, that was the product of economic policies that not only provided significant, in fact unprecedented, economic support both to individuals who had lost hours and indeed had been stood down through JobKeeper, Mr Speaker, but also through the cash flow boost and the many other measures that supported businesses to see their way through at a time, particularly last year, at the outset of COVID, when the uncertainty was at such a level that it was like looking into an economic abyss. And so the certainty that was provided by the government to step in with the single largest economic intervention in Australia's history gave businesses, gave families, gave individual employees the confidence to be able to get up the next day and see it through, and do it again day after day, month after month. And the product of that was 1 million people getting back into work, particularly women and particularly young people, Mr Speaker. And that is something that this government did at a time of great challenge to the nation, and we continue to do it. As we work through these most recent challenges, when we have a country that is beset by lockdowns, Mr Speaker, as a result of the Delta strain of the virus that just doesn't affect Australia. It affects countries all around the world, including across the Tasman, in New Zealand, Mr Speaker, where they also fight this same challenge. And so as we go through these more recent months where the Delta strain of the virus is wreaking its impact, I tell you what will happen. We will get through it again. This government will continue to have the back of Australians and Australian businesses. We won't be going after them, Mr Speaker, like those opposite. We'll be there to support them. And we will continue to be there to support them. And with the national plan, Mr Speaker, as those vaccination rates, which are at world-leading levels, Mr Speaker, on a weekly basis per capita, Mr Speaker, with that, we will see the Australian economy come back from the challenges that it is currently experiencing. We will see that. How do we know that? Because we've done it once and we will do it again. And we have done it by supporting the ingenuity and the resilience and the determination of Australians and Australian business people. Mr Speaker, the people of this country have been through a lot, but I know that they will come through and they will be able to restore their livelihoods. They will be able to restore their lives. And the path to that is the national plan.
And I call the member for Ryan.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the Minister please update the House on how the vaccine rollout is continuing to ramp up, highlighted by a record number of vaccinations being administered last week to implement the national plan?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Ryan for his question. He is, of course, the son of a pharmacist, and proudly so. And there are now almost 3,000 pharmacies around Australia contributing to the vaccine rollout. They have already delivered over 311,000 vaccinations around Australia, and that's set to accelerate over the coming weeks particularly as the Moderna vaccine arrives in Australia and is added to the Pfizer and the AstraZeneca vaccine. Added and supplemented to the additional 500,000 doses which the Prime Minister and the Australian Government have been able to secure as a swap from Singapore. And that will mean earlier access to more doses for more Australians. We know, of course, this challenge is affecting every country. Singapore is facing its own challenges. We know that the world has seen over 683,000 cases, 683,000 cases and 8,500 lives officially lost in the last 24 hours in the latest evidence of a global pandemic which continues unabated. And so against that background, the fact that we have been able to deliver record weekly vaccinations at a rate in advance of even the highest weeks in the United States and the United Kingdom is a testament to the work of all of our health professionals right across Australia, our pharmacists, our GPs. I particularly want to give a shout out to our nurses who played such an extraordinary role throughout the pandemic, both in providing health care but also in providing vaccination. And then everybody involved in our state clinics, in particular our Indigenous clinics through the Aboriginal Medical Services. All of these are coming together. One particular figure that I want to focus on today, as we've now reached 19.36 million, is 12.1 million Australians who've had first doses. That means there are 2.4 million Australians to take us to the 70% first dose rate, and 4.4 million Australians to take us to the 16.5 million, which will represent the 80% rate. So 2.4 million Australians to get to 70% and 4.4 million Australians to get to 80%. Those are first doses, but we know that once they're through that door, they'll keep coming back. That's the critical thing. They will be back. And that means that we have Australians who are coming forward, who are presenting to be vaccinated. It's about protecting them and saving their lives, as we can see in the massive differential of lives lost between New South Wales now and Victoria a year ago. That's why vaccination matters, because it saves lives and protects lives.
The member for Fenner.
My question's to the Treasurer. Gerry Harvey has now repaid $6 million in JobKeeper out of the $13 billion that went to companies with rising revenue. Gerry Harvey thinks the money should be paid back. Why doesn't the Treasurer?
The Treasurer.
I thank the member for Fenner for his question. On the 25th of March this year, I did an interview on ABC Radio, and I said the following. I would welcome Gerry Harvey or any other major company that's in the position to repay the JobKeeper payments back. I would welcome that, Mr. Speaker. That is what I said in March of this year. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me remind the House of another quote. We've made it really clear for some time now that JobKeeper, which has been doing a lot of good in the economy, it's the reason that we proposed it in the first place. Mr. Speaker, that was said in this year. Who said that, Mr. Speaker? Who said it was doing really good and they proposed it in the first place? Mr. Speaker, the member for Rankin, Mr. Speaker, the member for Rankin. Only the Labor Party could say that they invented a program that they are now criticising.
The Treasurer will now just resume his seat for a second. The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Close, Mr. Speaker.
No.
Once was. Leader of the Opposition.
Leader of the Opposition.
Sorry. Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I was quite good at that job. The Treasurer on relevance wasn't asked about alternatives. We know we did support wage subsidies and we did support JobKeeper. That's why we voted for it. But this is about the rorting.
I'll just ask the Leader of the Opposition to resume his seat. Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat and won't use points of order to introduce new material. If he doesn't sort of like the question that's been asked, he can't alter it by way of a point of order, is the point I'm trying to make. I do, though, just say to the Treasurer, this was a specific question, and I think he's been entirely relevant to it when he first got to the dispatch box, but it isn't an opportunity to range more widely on the topic. So.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is a good opportunity to talk about the importance and the success of the JobKeeper program, a program that was described as remarkable by the Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, a program that was described as well targeted by the Federal Treasury in a review they did in mid-last year, a program that the Australian Tax Office delivered it, in the words of the Australian Audit Office, and effective in managing risks, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister earlier alluded to the economic abyss that Australia faced last year when we introduced the JobKeeper program. I want to point out to those opposite that business confidence fell by 62 points in March of last year, the largest single monthly decline and the lowest level since the survey began. But in the months following, business confidence increased by 17 points and then a further 26 points to May of last year. Over March 2020, consumer confidence fell by 38%, a record low for the index. The week following the announcement of JobKeeper, consumer confidence increased by 10 percentage points, and consumer confidence has continued to improve. Mr. Speaker, JobKeeper is perhaps the most remarkably successful economic support program this country has ever seen. And it's contributed to the strong rebound in the economy that we saw at the end of last year and the start of this year.
I call the member for Herbert.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government's significant investment in defence capability is keeping Australians safe and secure in a time of global uncertainty?
The Minister for Defence.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to say thank you very much to the member for Herbert, who, like all of those who have worn the uniform in our country's name, would be mourning the loss of the two soldiers who were tragically killed north of Townsville yesterday. And by way of update to the House, Mr. Speaker, two members of the Brisbane-based 7th Combat Brigade died following a vehicle incident at the Townsville field training area yesterday. The two men, one aged 29, the other a warrant officer 40, tragically lost their lives when the vehicle rolled. I want to recognise the Defence Rescue and medical teams who attended that scene in the most difficult, traumatic of circumstances, but sadly the members were unable to be saved. I want to say to all of those at Gallipoli Barracks and to all of those in particular at the 7th Combat Brigade that all of this Parliament and all Australians feel for you today, for the families of those lost, and we know that there will be very significant grief at Gallipoli Barracks today and at Laverick Barracks and indeed around the country. The Defence family is a very tight one, and we know that not only the families but the Defence families of these two men will be greatly mourning their loss, and we pay tribute to their service. Mr. Speaker, the Morrison government is committed to making sure that we can provide every support to those diggers. We do it in many, many ways. Mr. Speaker, taking care of our personnel is absolutely paramount. There are countless conversations that the Prime Minister and I have had about ways in which we can provide additional support to our servicemen and women who serve us, who protect us, who keep our country safe. Let's be very real. We live in a very uncertain time, not just in the Middle East, and we've seen the tragic circumstances there and circumstances in which our soldiers are deployed, but also in our own region, in the Indo-Pacific. And the fact that we've been able to commit to $270 billion over the course of this decade to provide the support by way of new equipment to those troops demonstrates our commitment to keeping our country safe. Mr. Speaker, at least 15,000 companies and 70,000 Australian workers are benefiting from the government investment into shipbuilding and defence. We're investing $65 billion over the next decade into next-generation air capabilities, including through acquiring long-range anti-ship missiles. We're investing $55 billion into land domain capabilities, such as strike weapons, watercraft, helicopters, robotics and autonomous systems. Our naval shipbuilding plan represents the largest regeneration of the Navy since the Second World War. That investment is absolutely essential, not only to keep the men and women of the Australian Defence Force safe, but, Mr Speaker, to keep our country safe. And we will continue to make decisions that support our personnel today and into the future.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, thanks, Mr Speaker. I join with the Minister for Defence in expressing condolences to the families of the two men in uniform who've lost their lives in the accident yesterday. There are many things that are up for debate in this chamber. One of the things that is not is support for the men and women who wear our uniform and keep us safe, for whom we all rely as a nation on for our national security.
The member for Whitlam.
My question's to the Prime Minister. This morning, the New South Wales Deputy Premier John Barilalo said in relation to the First Nations vaccine rollout, and I quote, "Should they have been vaccinated earlier? Yes. It was all part of the federal government's rollout of the vaccination program at the start of the year, and it didn't occur." Why did the Prime Minister get this so wrong?
The Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Vaccinating and indeed the public health of our Indigenous populations is a very high priority for the government, and there have been many challenges there, as there often is, in ensuring that we provide the best possible health care to our Indigenous Australians. And, Mr Speaker, this program in particular has had its challenges within Indigenous communities. And the Minister for Indigenous Australians has been working very closely with Indigenous communities to address these issues. And so I'll ask him, Mr Speaker, to update the House on those matters.
The Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In March of this year, AstraZeneca was rolled out to over 150 Aboriginal community-controlled health services to enable Aboriginal people to access them. Last year, there was an Aboriginal COVID vaccination committee stood up, co-chaired by Pat Turner, to develop a strategic approach to ensuring that there are adequate supplies provided to the ACCHOs. In addition to that are the many GPs to whom our people also access. The continuation of the rollout of the vaccine program is complemented by the strategic coordination that we commenced in March 2019, where I worked very closely with Ministers for Indigenous Affairs out of other jurisdictions on the application of the Biosecurity Act to lock down communities in the first instance. And that work has continued. 2 weeks ago, the Ministers for Aboriginal Affairs were briefed on the status of COVID supplies and strategies within their jurisdictions and what the Commonwealth was doing. They have joined with us in addressing and giving priority focus to the needs of their community-controlled health services, as well as aligning the resources that are available at the state and territory level. In talking with the Minister for Indigenous Affairs from WA, he made the comment, "I must have further discussion with my colleague Roger Cook, the Minister for Health, so that we ensure that we lift our vaccination rates." I find it interesting when people talk about hesitancy not being an issue, because really what that is doing is saying that Pat Turner and I are deceiving you on what the community is saying. The community is hesitant based on the information. I have listened to media interviews. Hesitancy is an issue that we have to overcome. And our work on the number of vaccinations is increasing. We have 37% have had their first dose. 20.5% have had their second dose, so the numbers are increasing. We still have a lot of work to do. And so we will continue to focus on making sure people are vaccinated and safe.
And I call the member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Home Affairs.
Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is backing our national security agencies to create a stronger Australia and keep all Australians safe against those who would seek to do us harm?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Thank you, and I thank the member for her question. Now, the security of our nation, of our families, of our businesses is an absolute priority for this government as we work through the various phases of our national plan and to return to our normal way of life. Now, while our frontline health workers have very rightly been in the spotlight during this pandemic, our law enforcement and national security agencies have also worked around the clock to deal with a new and evolving threat environment. Now, we all know that the world has changed since COVID, but that COVID is not the only challenge to our safety and security. And that's why our government continues to provide support to our law enforcement and our national security agencies so that they have the tools that they need. So we are certainly equipping them for their fight against terrorism, on organised crime and to counter foreign interference, all with the very clear goal of making sure that we are making our communities safe and secure. Now, it was only a couple of months ago that we saw the enormous success of the AFP's Operation Ironside, which cut through the Australian criminal underworld. Now, the foundation of that success were the laws that this government had introduced to keep our agencies well ahead of the game, particularly in relation to technology. So in the last few months alone, our government has gone even further to keep Australians safe. We've made ports and airports safer and more secure by ensuring that people with serious criminal backgrounds cannot work there. We've secured key counter-terrorism tools, including control orders, which are used to ensure the safety and security of all Australians. We've passed new laws to give police and intelligence agencies greater ability to tackle criminal activity online, making the internet a safer place for everyone, especially for our children. And we've improved foreign intelligence capability to make sure that our agencies are better equipped and better able to detect and determine any imminent threats, which is especially important to protect us from terrorists' attacks. So we are making sure as a government that our agencies are very well equipped to deal with the emerging threats as and when they happen. And that's why we have provided record funding both to ASIO and to the Australian Federal Police. And I can assure Australians that this government is absolutely committed to making sure that we are doing all that we possibly can to ensure the safety and security of all Australians.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister announced that all aged care workers would have had at least one COVID dose by the 17th of September. But today, New South Wales Health Minister Brad Hazzard said he is, quote, not at all confident that will happen. Will the Prime Minister ensure that all aged care workers receive a vaccine by the 17th of September to protect them, but also to protect the people in their care?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Minister for Health and Aged Care will add to this answer. I can confirm that aged care workers currently, first dose outcomes are 78.8% and second dose outcomes are 56.7%. Now, importantly, Mr Speaker, those they look after, aged care residents, first doses 89% and second doses 84.4%. The primary reason that we are not seeing the same level of fatality as we saw during the Victorian outbreak has been principally the vaccination that was undertaken as the top priority of getting to every single residential aged care facility in this country and vaccinating those residents. That alone has saved, we know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lives. Hundreds and hundreds of lives. And I want to thank all those InReach teams that made it their priority to do that. There are still challenges with the InReach to reach all of those aged care workers. But General Frewen and his team continue to work diligently to that end, and I'll ask the Minister to add to the answer.
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And to add to the Prime Minister's answer, he's correct that two fundamental outcomes of the last year have been 89% of residents around Australia having been vaccinated, and we continue to encourage all of the families to ensure that they do give consent for their elderly residents to be vaccinated. It's just absolutely fundamental. Equally, we want to encourage every one of the aged care workers to take up the opportunity. Every aged care worker will have that opportunity. We have done what other jurisdictions have not, but which they are now considering with regards to healthcare workers. And on the medical advice, we did put in place a requirement that all aged care workers, unless they have an exemption, do have vaccination as a workplace requirement. What that has done, it has seen a skyrocketing of rates. So there has been a significant period of access since March for aged care workers. What we have done, though, is supplement that with a combination of general practice, pharmacy, state clinics, Commonwealth vaccination clinics, hubs, 39 hubs around Australia, and now in terms of the other channels that are available, we have the InReach channels in particular. 1,000 on-site clinics at residential aged care facilities have already been delivered. 670 on-site clinics organised by residential aged care providers themselves. And we also have 585 on-site clinics delivered by GPs or Commonwealth vaccination clinics. All of these are giving every aged care worker the opportunity to be vaccinated.
Has concluded, and I call the member for Curtin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment, representing the Minister for Women. Will the Minister please advise the House on measures the Morrison government is taking to address the issue of women's safety, and how the upcoming National Summit on Women's Safety will progress the development of the next National Action Plan to end violence against women and their children?
The Minister representing the Minister for Women.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the member for Curtin for her question? She's an educator, a lawyer, was a Vice-Chancellor, and brings a wealth of experience, particularly with her deep understanding of women's issues, to the Federal Parliament. The Morrison government is absolutely focused on making Australia a place that is free from violence against women and their children. And we demonstrated our commitment to this in the 2021-22 budget, where we made the largest ever commitment to women's safety, $1.1 billion. And the upcoming Women's Safety Summit on Monday and Tuesday of next week has roundtables later this week on Thursday and Friday. I look forward to participating in those. It's a crucial part of developing our next steps. The roundtables will have full and frank discussions with stakeholders who work on the front line, with people who understand how we need to build the system for the victims, for their children and for the future. The summit will give us an opportunity to shine a light on the terrible violence that women and families from all walks of life experience. It will discuss key issues for women's safety, including financial security, policing and justice responses, sexual violence, and the often unique challenges facing, for example, migrant communities, Indigenous communities, rural and regional Australians. Now, breaking the cycle of violence and offending by perpetrators has to be a key focus. And that's why programs like the Coordinated Enforcement and Support to Eliminate Domestic Violence program, the CEASE program, which was announced by Minister Ruston in the other place, are so important. Protecting women and children from violence is not just about providing emergency interventions and justice, but it includes critical intervention, prevention, changing behaviour, so that we can hold perpetrators to account but prevent repeat offences. The CEASE program will ensure justice pathways and, in certain low-risk instances, rehabilitation and drug and alcohol treatments. Every instance of family and intimate partner violence is different and complex. As I sat in the Downing Centre local court on DV listing day a few months ago with the Women's Domestic Violence Court Advocacy Service and listened to victim survivors seek justice and the best outcomes for their families, the need for high-risk offender targeting and low-risk diversion programs that support victims became apparent. So I look forward to this trial announced by Minister Ruston, and of course it's just one part of our very coordinated response to women's safety. The summit is just so important as we develop the next national plan towards ending violence against women and their children. And along with other ministers in the other place, I look forward to updating the Parliament on the outcomes of the summit and the next important steps the Morrison government intends to take.
The member for Newcastle.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Prime Minister. Today is Equal Pay Day. Will the Prime Minister adopt Labor's plan to require companies with more than 250 staff to publicly report their gender pay gap and to prohibit pay secrecy clauses that prevent some employees from disclosing their remuneration?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And I note that the gender pay cap is now at 14.2%. And, Mr Speaker, when we came to government, it was 17.4%, Mr Speaker. And Mr Speaker, and it rose even higher than that, as the Treasurer reminds me, 18.2% while Labor was in government. And this is something I'm sure that everyone in this House is working to achieve the outcomes that ensures that we close that gap. And that Australian women, who make up the majority of those who lost jobs during the COVID-19 crisis and ongoing, Mr Speaker, they have also been those who have most fully participated in the comeback of the job creation that we saw after the COVID-19 recession of last year. The female participation rate still exceeds pre-COVID-19 levels at 61.4% in July of 2021. 1 million jobs have been created since May 2020, and 54.4% of those jobs, Mr Speaker, have gone to women. There are 78,000 more women employed in the most recent figures of July 2021 than in March of 2020, before the impact of COVID-19. Now, we've delivered record high women's workforce participation and record low gender pay gaps, Mr Speaker, and our economic plan, the economic plan that was set out in last year's budget, the economic recovery plan from COVID-19, which continues to support getting women more opportunities to participate in the workforce, Mr Speaker, as the Women's Economic Security Statement underpinned. That budget statement included $1.9 billion to support women's workforce participation and economic security, $1.7 billion to increase the childcare subsidy for families with 2 and more children aged 5 and under, $42.4 million, Mr Speaker, over 7 years, $24.7 over the next 4 years to support nearly 600 women to pursue higher-level STEM qualifications, $38.3 million over 5 years, Mr Speaker, in the Women's Leadership and Development Program to boost women's employment opportunities and set Australian women up for future jobs. We're removing the $450 a month threshold for the superannuation guarantee at a cost of $31.5 million, Mr Speaker. Our government continues to see more women realising their economic opportunities in this country, whether it's to secure the career they're seeking, Mr Speaker, to have the choices that they want to have in this country and that they haven't had, Mr Speaker, in the past, and securing those opportunities for them in their future. But all of it is underpinned by something very important, and that is the economic plan that actually lifts the whole country, Mr Speaker. The economic plan that lifts the whole country. And we know and we have seen the resilience of the Australian economy, Mr Speaker, throughout this pandemic. And despite the blows of COVID, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Flynn. Yep.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Water and Resources. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison-Joyce government's commitment to sticking to the national plan will help sectors like the resource sector safely reopen, and what opportunities exist for communities such as mine and Flynn? Is the Minister aware of any alternative policy approaches?
The Minister for Resources and Water.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Flynn? We know where the member for Flynn stands when it comes to sticking to the national plan. You've only got to go to his Facebook page, see his big smiling dial with a sign that says, "I want to reopen Australia." I want to reopen Australia. And Mr Speaker, this is incredibly important for the resources sector. Incredibly important for the resources sector. We've seen this week BHP announce that they will have vaccinations on site at the Mount Arthur coal mine in the Hunter, Mr Speaker. They will roll that out through Queensland, South Australia and Western Australia. BHP, as a big Australian, recognise how important it is to stick to the national plan. Now, the sector has done a phenomenal job, Mr Speaker. Throughout the last 12 months, the last financial year, they have hit a record export, $310 billion, in a situation without vaccinations. They've kept their people safe. Up until very recently, there hadn't been a single outbreak in a resources site. That has meant they've continued to contribute to our economy. They've actually put on tens of thousands of jobs, not gone backwards, and they know how important it is that we stick to the national plan, Mr Speaker. But I am asked about alternatives. Now, the alternatives, Mr Speaker, are very straightforward. It is forecast that $344 billion worth of economic activity will occur this financial year. The alternative to that policy is to not stick to the national plan and not deliver that economic boost and increase. We have put on tens of thousands of jobs last financial year. There will be tens of thousands of jobs this financial year to hit that target of $344 billion. The alternative policy is to not support the national plan, not deliver more jobs, not deliver more economic activity. Now, Mr Speaker, we know those opposite are confident in an each-way bet. They need to be out there publicly supporting the national plan because it is important for our country. It is important for our country, Mr Speaker. Now, we know that there are other options, and the other options include saying to the resources sector employees, thank you so much for what you've done in the last 12 months. Terribly sorry about the fact that you've been out there, sometimes away for weeks, sometimes away for months. But if we don't stick with the national plan, that will continue, Mr Speaker. And while I have the opportunity, I want to thank those hard-working men and women in the resources sector who have done above and beyond. They have literally been away for weeks, for some 4 months. For some, they have had to move their families from state to state. We cannot continue to add to our economy through the resources sector if there are continual lockdowns. If we stop borders, if we continue the closures, we have a large fly-in, fly-out workforce. They are necessary and essential for the operation of the resources sector. Sticking to the national plan delivers for our country, delivers for our economy, delivers for the hard-working men and women, and they deserve a break, Mr Speaker.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. In his media conference today, the Prime Minister was asked about changes to restrictions based on vaccination rates. And the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "Ultimately, everything is a state matter." Won't the Prime Minister take responsibility for anything?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, that is just sad. Honestly, that is just sad, Mr Speaker, the way that the opposition
Members
come in
on both
here
sides.
and seek to twist and turn comments, Mr Speaker. I was referring to public health orders and the public health social measures that are the province of the states and territories, Mr Speaker. These are not new powers of the states and territories. They have always had them. They haven't been referred to them. They haven't been granted to them, Mr Speaker. They are the responsibilities that states and territories have always had, Mr Speaker. The opposition needs to grow up.
Prime Minister has indicated he's completed his answer. And I call the member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the Minister please outline for the House how the Morrison government's national plan is critical to building the workforce that will be required to help deliver our $270 billion capability investment as we come back from the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Stirling and acknowledge and thank him for his service to our nation. Mr Speaker, repeated lockdowns and border closures continue to place challenges on Australian businesses, including our Australia's defence industry. Defence industry relies on the free movement of key equipment and personnel across states and territories. So any impact to that supply chain clearly has an impact when we're talking about the development of our defence capabilities. Mr Speaker, over the last 18 months, my priority has been to keep the wheels of defence industry turning. A big focus with industry to make sure they're building up their skill set and their critical workforce. Since late 2020, more than 60 small and medium-sized Australian defence industry businesses have shared almost $4 million in grants through the Skilling Australia's Defence Industry Program. This is a grant program that supports businesses to upskill and retrain their employees so they have the skills to make sure our Defence Force gets what it needs. Mr Speaker, our government recently launched the Defence Industries Pathway Program. This is a $10 million pilot investment to provide trainee placements for WA school leavers to build skills and experience and qualifications with shipbuilding companies in Henderson, WA. Mr Speaker, I want to acknowledge that this particular traineeship is not possible without the cooperation of West Australian shipbuilders. So I just want to thank them for that. 40 trainees have already commenced their journey, and there'll be another 80-odd trainees that will continue throughout the rest of this year and also next year. I did have the opportunity to meet a number of these trainees down in Henderson in July, and can I tell you how excited they were to be able to taking their first steps to be able to be a part of a very exciting shipbuilding industry. Mr Speaker, the program is laying the foundations to build our Australians' workforce to make sure we can deliver on our $270 billion investment in our defence capabilities. And the key to building on this success, Mr Speaker, is the National Plan, announced by our Prime Minister and endorsed by the National Cabinet. And this plan has given our defence industry a tremendous boost, Mr Speaker. And at the heart of the National Plan is to accelerate and roll out our vaccination rates right across the country. And I think we're all immensely proud in this House for the way the Australians have been rolling up their sleeves and just doing their bit to get their jab. As of yesterday, more than 19 million COVID vaccines have been given to Australians. Mr Speaker, I want to give a shout out and acknowledge regional Western Australians who are doing their bit to help us with the National Plan. Many people, most of them live in the seat of Durack, but also in the seat of O'Connor as well. They have to travel hundreds and hundreds of kilometres, many of them, to get their vaccine. They are doing their bit, and I just want to tell them that our nation is incredibly grateful for them doing their bit.
The member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to reports the Secretary of the Department of Health wrote to intensive care doctors on Friday, asking them whether they think the health system can deal with an influx of COVID patients. 18 months into the pandemic, why has the Morrison-Joyce government waited until now to check whether the hospital system is coping?
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the assertion put forward by the questioner is completely false. It is just completely false, Mr Speaker. If the Labor Party cared to pay any attention to what was going on, they would know that for months and months and months, Mr Speaker, the Secretary of the Department of Health has been providing regular updates to the Premiers, the Chief Ministers and myself, upgrading the views about the status of the public hospital system and the public health system and their response capacity to the COVID-19 pandemic. That has been happening since the outbreak of the pandemic. And to suggest otherwise, Mr Speaker, is just a deliberate attempt by the Labor Party to undermine public confidence in the COVID response. Mr Speaker, that is becoming a very regular theme from the Labor Party, to undermine the response. They're for and against JobKeeper, Mr Speaker. They undermine the economic measures. They undermine the serious investment made by the Commonwealth, some $6 billion to support public hospitals, Mr
Prime
Speaker.
Minister will resume
$6 billion.
his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, Mr Speaker, there have been many questions today that have asked about alternative policies, but this is not one of them, on direct relevance.
Yeah, I'm listening to the Prime Minister. The question was specific. He certainly addressed it, and I have, as I often do, allowed a little bit of latitude for some context, and I think the Prime Minister's probably done that. The Prime Minister.
Since the beginning of this pandemic, we've been working with the states and territories to bolster the ICU capacity, the flexibility within our hospital system, the ability to move staff and resources around the country to respond to the needs that may present, Mr Speaker, and indeed may well present in the future. Because what we know about COVID is very uncertain. There are new strains, and we need to be prepared to respond, and that is exactly what's occurring, Mr Speaker. And the Secretary of the Department of Health has been tasked again to do even further work on that, because that is part of the national plan. The national plan seeks to put in place vaccinations at 70 and 80% to the move to the next steps, and that is supported by a number of other important measures. There's the testing, the tracing, the isolation and the quarantine. And as we move into Phase B and Phase C, home quarantine will be very important, because home quarantine is what allows Australians to travel again and return and get more Australians home. And the way TTIQ works in Phase B and Phase C is what is being worked on together. In addition, Mr Speaker, there is the public health social measures that need to be kept in place at low levels to support the higher levels of vaccination to ensure that Australians can live with this virus. And there is also the essential support that is necessary to bolster our public health system. Mr Speaker, and our government, we have continued to increase our investment in public hospitals, not just when we hit the pandemic, Mr Speaker, but over our entire term of government. Indeed, in Western Australia, the rate of increase of our investment in public hospitals in Western Australia has been 4 times that of what has occurred at a state level in Western Australia, Mr Speaker, and we will continue to do that under our hospitals agreement. But in particular during this pandemic, our 50-50 agreement with the states and territories has seen us already invest $6 billion supporting states and territories with their public health systems. Mr Speaker, I would encourage the Labor Party to stop being so negative, to support the national plan.
Concluded. And I call the member for Berowra.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the Minister update the House on why sticking with the Morrison government's national plan is essential to supporting Australian manufacturers to grow, create jobs and secure our recovery?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question, for his support for the manufacturing sector. And there are 31,840 manufacturers across the member's home state of New South Wales. They're obviously doing it tough at the moment, but showing enormous resilience. And in fact, the resilience of the manufacturing sector as a whole is something throughout COVID that we can be very proud of as Australians. In the March quarter, manufacturing profits actually rose by 6.8%, which is a remarkable result, and in fact they were 16% higher over the year. But the manufacturers that I'm speaking to at the moment, they say they cannot cope with lockdowns forever, and they note 2 things. They need continuity of access to 2 critical parts of their business. They need continuity of access to their critical and skilled workforce and to their markets. And that's why we're supporting those manufacturers, the Morrison government, with a national plan and path out of lockdowns, because they need that access to their workforces and to their markets. And we're also backing manufacturers to grow and create jobs on the other side of COVID with the $1.5 billion modern manufacturing strategy across 6 manufacturing priorities. And recently, $50 million of investment was made in one of those priorities, which is minerals and resources technology. Now, that sector, as we've heard today from several ministers, generates enormous wealth in Australia, $114 billion in revenue, and it supports 200,000 jobs. And what we have is an opportunity for enormous growth in secondary manufacturing and expansion off the back of that resources sector. And one great example is mining equipment. That industry alone, the equipment market for mining, is expected to generate worldwide revenue of $165 billion by 2027. So that is an area that we think has potential for great growth in Australia. And I want to give an example for the House today. One of the recipients of the recent grants was Flipscreen Australia. They've designed screening buckets that can be attached to any skid steer, excavator or loader. And unlike what we would see in a normal front-end loader, they can actually screen contaminants out of the product. And that's an innovation that started on the floor of a small hay shed in Mangapla, and it will help grow Wagga Wagga into a regional manufacturing hub. $10 million of investment will help this Australian company expand this world-leading product line and build new heavy steel fabrication facility so that they can produce and export much larger versions of their product, which are able to screen 3,000 tonnes of material per hour. And what does this mean? It's a $35 million project, 619 direct and indirect jobs over the first 5 years, and with a partnership of the Riverina TAFE, it will train and upskill many workers in the regions. So what our manufacturers are saying is that they need a clear, consistent and secure and known path out of lockdowns, and that will help them, with grants like this, grow on the other side of COVID and produce a boom in this sector for our economy.
The Prime
Thank you,
Minister.
Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
The Leader of the House with papers.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. A document is tabled in accordance with the list circulated to honourable members earlier today. Full details of the document will be recorded in the votes and proceedings.
And I call the member for Indi.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I move that so much of standing orders be suspended that would prevent the member for Indi from moving the following motion: that this House, 1, notes that on September the 8th it will be 1,000 days since the Prime Minister made an election promise to establish a Federal Integrity Commission. B, the Prime Minister has failed to introduce a bill to Parliament to do so. And C, Parliament will rise in 2 days' time for a 6-week break, during which the Prime Minister could call an election at any moment. 2, calls on the government to abandon its Commonwealth Integrity Commission proposal, which retired judges and academic experts have described as ineffective and unamendable. B, establish a strong, well-funded, wide-ranging and independent Integrity Commission through the Australian Federal Integrity Commission Bill that I introduced to this House almost 1 year ago. C, admit it has deliberately stalled progress on a reform that over 80% of Australians across the political spectrum have called for as a matter of urgency. D, admit it has failed to meet a key election commitment to the Australian people. And E, acknowledge that their inaction has compounded falling trust in government at a time where trust in government is crucial to our safety and prosperity. Mr Speaker, next week it will be 1,000 days since the Prime Minister promised the Australian people an Integrity Commission. Australians are still waiting. It's blindingly obvious the Prime Minister will not deliver one. Right now, Australians are putting their faith in government in ways we've never seen before. From lockdown orders to the vaccine rollout, Australians are living up to their side of the bargain. And in exchange, when it comes to integrity, this government is taking them for fools. The Prime Minister knows his Commonwealth Integrity Commission is a dud. He's been pretending to consult on it for over 3 years. 333 submissions in the latest round, almost a year ago. Only 2 had anything positive to say. None supported it as a whole. It's dead in the water. It would never pass the Senate. From former High Court Justice Mary Gaudron to Tony Fitzgerald, it's been called toothless and unamendable. The government knows that. The opposition knows that. Every Australian knows it. Over 8 in 10 Australians want a robust Integrity Commission. And with respect to colleagues on both sides, a bill for an Integrity Commission would be ill-fated if it came from a major party. An important reform like this is best placed to come right through the middle from the crossbench. That's why I introduced the Australian Federal Integrity Commission Bill over a decade ago. It's a consensus bill that has been regarded as the most robust model in the nation. It's learnt from the failures of state ICACs. It builds on over a decade of merry-go-round consultations and inquiries in this place. It's sensible, it's balanced, it's written in the public interest. It's sitting there right now, ready to be debated and voted on. Questions of integrity have plagued this parliament. Australians do not want to head into another election without a robust Federal Integrity Commission. There is no excuse for this anymore, Prime Minister. Introduce a robust bill, or step aside and let the Parliament vote on mine. And with that in mind, I seek leave to table this document which lists the names of thousands of Australians calling on the Prime Minister to do the right thing or step out of the way.
Is leave granted?
Leave's not granted.
Leave is not granted. Is the motion seconded?
Has she moved to suspension or asked for leave?
The member for Indi sought leave to table a document.
This document.
Yeah, leave was not granted. Now we're moving to, is the motion seconded? The motion seconded?
Mr. Speaker, I second the motion. The member for Indi has come before this chamber promoting a National Integrity Commission. Let me say this on behalf of the Australian Labor Party. We support a National Anti-Corruption Commission. We support a National Anti-Corruption Commission with teeth, a National Anti-Corruption Commission with independence, a National Anti-Corruption Commission that can deal with some of the travesties of the use of public funds that we've seen from those opposite over the last 8 years, and in particular over this term of Parliament. When you have the abuse of taxpayer funds that you have seen through the Sport Trotts program, through the abuse of the commuter parks program, through where you have car parks for commuters where there's no train station. You have in the Treasurer's electorate which received 4 separate grants. What we have from this government when it decides where public funds are going to be used is they get out a colour-coded sheet based upon the marginality of electorates. And then when the Senate has the temerity to ask for access to those documents, they say it's cabinet in confidence. Oh, it's a secret. This is a government that has established structures to avoid transparency and public accountability. Right. They have a cabinet committee with a membership of 1, the Prime Minister, who then co-opts people onto any meeting in which he has so that it becomes so-called cabinet in confidence. And remember that this is a Prime Minister who puts his former Chief of Staff and now Head of Prime Minister and Cabinet in charge of inquiries, including into what his own office knew about a reported sexual assault just metres from his office. And then of course, he says that they can't, they delay that report for so long that it can't be dealt with because the court case is already underway about that. All he had to do was ask his own staff what they knew, who knew what and when. But what we have from this government when it comes to the use of public funds is scandal after scandal, whether it be regional programs, whether it be Sport Trotts programs, the allocation of funds for Urban Congestion Fund, a program of over $4 billion which has been allocated on the basis of political need, not on the basis of merit, which is why we do need a National Integrity Commission. Now, when the current Prime Minister knocked off Malcolm Turnbull, remember that? He wasn't ambitious for himself, he was ambitious for him. He wasn't ambitious to lead. Well, that's the one thing he did get right, because we've seen no leadership from this Prime Minister. What we saw was that in terms of this government and their approach to these issues is that we do need a National Integrity Commission. The Prime Minister in 2018, 3 years ago now, promised when he took office that we would have one, and 3 years later he just hasn't got around to it. And it's no wonder because of the stench that surrounds this government's commitments in the lead up to the 2019 election. And quite frankly, and they're on notice that the 21 separate slush funds that were allocated and set up in the budget this year will be the subject of integrity and having a good look at how those funds are allocated. Taxpayers' funds are not the same as Liberal and National Party funds. You shouldn't be using Liberal and National Party, you shouldn't be using money that is taxpayers for the interests of Liberal and National Party. Right. And they even do, basically, polling with the same companies that do the polling for the Liberal and National parties. Yep. What we see from the member for Indi is someone who I don't agree, perhaps, with her exact model, but what we do need is a body of substance. What we do need is this Prime Minister to be kept to his commitments, and that's why we need some transparency and accountability. Quite frankly, I sat in this chamber during the Howard government. And by and large, ministers, I disagree with what they did. But there wasn't scandal after scandal the way that this government operates.
The honourable
there wasn't
Leader
ministers
of the Opposition's
being able
time
to
has
just
expired.
keep going.
The question is that the motion be disagreed to, and I give the call to the member for Warringah.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Regular surveys show that over 80% of Australians support the establishment of a federal corruption watchdog. With the limited time left in this term of Parliament, we ought to be concentrating our efforts on things that need to be done now. I'm calling on the Prime Minister to make good on his 2018 promise to establish a Federal Integrity Commission. All states and territories have an Integrity Commission, yet there is no proper body to investigate serious allegations of abuse of position or power at a federal level. The closest thing we have is the Auditor General's office. The Auditor General is going above and beyond to investigate matters of misuse of funds, but the list keeps growing. Most recently, the Auditor revealed car park rules. There are now questions over donations made by Empire Energy and grants awarded to the company to explore gas for the Beetaloo Basin. Australians need to have confidence that this government is actually working and the decisions are made on merit and properly. Despite the many scandals that have been revealed, there is a little that can be done to investigate and prosecute those accused of wrongdoing because we don't have an Integrity Commission. There are three things this government can do to clean up politics in this country, and that would be a great legacy for the Morrison government. To establish a Federal Integrity Commission, to establish a code of conduct for all parliamentarians, and to pass truth in political advertising legislation. Thank you.
The question is that the motion be disagreed to, and I give the call to the member for Melbourne.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. We need a Federal Anti-Corruption Commission, and we need it now. The Prime Minister promised about 3 years ago, 1,000 days ago, that there was going to be one, and there still isn't. Why? What has this government got to hide? It's rort after rort, scandal after scandal from this government, and it looks as if the government is just running a protection racket. Now, I was very pleased to introduce the first ever anti-corruption bill into the House of Representatives. And I'm very pleased that other members, including the member who's moved this motion, the member for Indi, have brought forward their models as well. If the government wants legislation to pass for an anti-corruption commission, a bill has already passed the Senate, a bill that has widespread support across the political spectrum and independent experts backing it up because it works. And that bill is now awaiting a vote in this House. The government could have an anti-corruption commission tomorrow, but it is choosing not to. And instead, it's coming up with its own model that gives a free pass to politicians, that ensures that there won't be the kind of public hearings that the members of the public expect. And as we look around the country and see that anti-corruption commissions around the country have resulted in Liberal, Labor ministers across the political spectrum, in many instances being taken to court and in some instances going to jail. They know that it restores a bit of integrity and a bit of trust in the political process. Now, Deputy Speaker, if anyone thinks that corruption stops at state borders, I've got a bridge to sell you. People know that an anti-corruption commission means that there's a hand on the shoulder of every minister who's making a decision about where to allocate money. And it reminds governments that it is not their own money, it is the public's money. We need it. We need it now. I commend the member for Indi for bringing this, and I urge the government to just support the Greens bill that has already passed the Senate.
All right, I'll state the question, and that is, the question is that the motion be disagreed to. All those that are of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I've received a letter from the honourable member for Fenner proposing that a definite